Sometimes I think memory is just a soft echo, something that calls your name from another room and disappears when you turn your head. And yet there are days when the past walks right up, taps me on the shoulder, and asks, "Remember what this place used to feel like?" 25 years ago, around 1999 into the early 2000s, Canada had this curious in-between energy, half digital, half paper, stumbling into the 21st century with a Tim Hortons double-double in one hand and a brick-sized Nokia 5190 Sear in the other. We didn't know it, but we were living through the last gasp of a slower Canada, a country where you still checked the weather by turning on CBC News World at 28 after the hour. I was in my early 20s then, feeling like the whole country existed as a long stretch of two-lane highways and analog radio. Satellite TV was a luxury, DVDs were the future, and the average Canadian home computer still had that beige IBM-era casing that hummed like a small appliance. The internet? Slow enough that you could click a hyperlink, go microwave leftovers, and return just as the page finished loading. The idea of broadband for everyone felt as futuristic as teleportation. But the thing that really stands out is how local everything felt. Grocery stores carried regional brands that have since disappeared in corporate mergers. Every town had at least one independent hardware store run by someone who knew all your uncles. Canada was still wrestling with the aftermath of the 1995 Quebec referendum, and national unity was the topic adults talked about when they thought kids weren't listening. You'd hear references to the Clarity Act on the radio, a term most of us pretended we understood. Transportation was different too. Gas hovered around prices that would make any modern Canadian weep. Air travel was still reeling from the 1999 creation of Air Canada's monopoly after buying Canadian Airlines, and anyone who remembers flying from Winnipeg to Thunder Bay during those years can testify, monopoly is not a comforting word. Via Rail limped along, as it still does, but there was a stronger sense, maybe misplaced optimism, that passenger rail might make a comeback eventually. And the border with the U.S.? Crossing in 1999 felt almost absurdly casual compared to today. A driver's license and polite conversation often did the trick. If you told a border guard you were going to Grand Forks to shop at Target, they nodded and waved you through like you were running a wholesome cultural exchange mission. Even the weather felt different. I don't just mean the climate trends, though winter temperatures were more consistently cold in many regions then, but the way we talked about the weather. It was our national binding agent, the original social network. Before smartphones, you'd find Canadians gathered around actual bulletin boards at community centers, checking posted updates for storm warnings. But more than the details, what stands out about Canada in 1999 is the mood. There was uncertainty about globalization, hope for technological progress, worry about Y2K, pride about the recent success of Celine Dion and the tragic hip, and a lingering sense that we were still a relatively small, quiet country trying to define itself. Looking back now, I realize none of us had any idea how quickly things were about to change. Sometimes I miss the quiet, not the silence, but the feeling of having fewer voices in your head. Life in Canada 25 years ago had a kind of built-in spaciousness, like the country itself was giving everyone a little more room to breathe. Take the cities. Toronto in 1999 was already big, but not impossibly big. The skyline still had gaps. The CN Tower dominated everything because the condo boom hadn't yet rewritten the horizon. I remember walking along Queen West when you could still find a one-bedroom apartment for under $900 without needing a second job or an inheritance. Vancouver real estate, while never cheap, hadn't yet surpassed the point where international investors treated it like a vending machine for luxury condos. Montreal still felt defiantly affordable, almost mischievously so. Public spaces had a different energy. Downtown cores didn't have the glow of thousands of smartphone screens at night. You'd see people waiting for buses reading newspapers, the actual paper kind, folded like origami in their hands. Students in coffee shops wrote essays longhand, their laptops too heavy to carry everywhere. The urban soundscape was cassette Walkman clicks, not notification pings. Even driving had an analog rhythm. Paper maps lived in glove compartments like sacred texts. You'd pull over, unfold them across the steering wheel, and trace routes with your finger. Getting lost wasn't a mistake, it was a rite of passage. And when you finally arrived in Halifax or Saskatchewan or Red Deer, you'd find local radio stations broadcasting actual humans, not automated playlists. There was always some late-night host who sounded like he'd been awake for 16 days discussing highway conditions and giving shout-outs to truckers. Some things people forget. Debit cards didn't have tap yet. You inserted the card, entered your PIN, and prayed it didn't demagnetize. Interac e-transfer didn't exist until 2003. You settled debts with cash, checks, or by hoping your friend forgot. Milk came in bags in Ontario and Quebec. Okay, still does, but back then it didn't feel like a cultural oddity. Canadian Tire money was basically a backup currency. Culturally, the country was shifting, but still holding on to older expectations. Hockey Night in Canada was still broadcast with Ron MacLean and Don Cherry in their classic era. The Tragic Hip were touring constantly, spreading Canadiana like wandering poets. And in classrooms, overhead projectors were the height of teaching technology, those buzzing glass boxes that cooked your fingers if you touched the wrong part. Americans would once visit and comment on how orderly Canada seemed. And in a way we were. Crime rates were falling. The national mood was calm compared to the political intensity south of the border. We were the quiet neighbor, the one who shoveled our driveway at 6 a.m. so nobody slipped. But beneath that calm was a brewing transformation. Urbanization speeding up, immigration beginning to reshape major cities in wonderful and complex ways, Indigenous rights conversations growing louder and more urgent, and early digital technologies preparing to swallow everything we considered normal. If the late 90s were Canada's calm before the shift, the next decade would be the pivot point. Sometimes change sneaks in wearing familiar clothes. That was the internet in Canada around the millennium. Comfortably strange, fascinating in its promise, and absolutely terrible at its job. If you were online in 1999, you remembered dial-up, that shrieking electronic handshake that sounded like robots arguing at a Seagull convention. Most Canadians used providers like Simpatico or local ISPs with names like Cyberwave or Netlink 2000. Speeds were so slow that downloading a single MP3 might take 20 minutes, longer if someone in your house picked up the phone. And yet that slowness created an odd kind of intimacy. You didn't browse mindlessly, you ventured online, like setting off in a canoe with only enough daylight to check your Hotmail inbox. Hotmail, by the way, was the place for a Canadian email address before Gmail arrived in 2004. The early internet didn't just change how Canadians communicated, it changed what we talked about. We were suddenly more connected to global debates, American culture, and each other's internal monologues. Forums like Maple Leaf Web, early sports message boards, and proto-social networks gave Canadians a place to hash out politics and identity in ways that felt thrillingly new. There was also a distinct Canadian digital culture emerging. Much Music's website was wildly influential, with chat rooms during shows like Electric Circus. CBC.ca began posting news online, transforming how people consumed information. Canadian universities became early broadband hubs, giving students near-mythical download speeds compared to home internet. Meanwhile, government institutions were slowly digitizing. The Canada Revenue Agency began allowing online tax filing in the late 1990s, though many Canadians didn't trust it yet. Health records, court documents, and municipal services were still largely paper-based, meaning file cabinets outnumbered servers in most offices. The interesting shift was psychological. The internet blurred the border with the US more than any trade agreement. Canadians who grew up with 6 TV channels suddenly had access to American news, entertainment, and discourse at all hours. Our sense of cultural insulation, already cracked by NAFTA in 1994, thinned further. In earlier decades, Canada consumed the US like a neighbor's loud stereo. By 2000, we were living inside the speaker. But the flip side was pride. Canadian creators, web cartoonists, bloggers, musicians uploading early demos to mp3.com found global audiences without leaving Saskatoon or Moncton. For a country that had long worried about being overshadowed, the early internet offered a new kind of visibility. Looking back, 1999 was the last year where logging off meant actually disappearing for a while. We didn't know it, but we were standing on the shoreline of an ocean that would soon swallow every aspect of daily life: work, love, memory, identity. And once smartphones arrived, the tide never receded. Memory can fool you into thinking a country changes slowly, but when I revisit old photos of Toronto or Calgary from 1999, I feel like I'm staring at a parallel universe, a Canada familiar in shape but unrecognizable in texture. Immigration was already central to Canada's identity, but the scale and diversity of it accelerated dramatically in the 2000s and 2010s. In 1999, Canada admitted roughly 189,000 permanent residents. By the mid-2010s, that number regularly exceeded 250,000, and by the early 2020s, it surged past 400,000 annually. Most Canadians over 40 can feel this transformation in small ways: the changing languages on subway platforms, new grocery aisles with ingredients our parents couldn't pronounce, the mosaic of cultural festivals that now fill urban summers. This didn't just diversify the population, it redesigned entire neighborhoods. Surrey in BC grew into one of the largest South Asian cultural hubs in North America. Richmond became a city where Chinese was spoken as commonly as English. Toronto's suburbs, Mississauga, Brampton, Markham, became multicultural centers in their own right, their identities no longer dependent on downtown. Back in 1999, multiculturalism was already official policy, thanks to the 1988 Multiculturalism Act. But the real lived experience was still taking shape. My generation grew up thinking cultural mosaic sounded idealistic. Today, it sounds descriptive. Meanwhile, Canada's aging population was quietly rewriting the economic landscape. In 1999, the median age was about 36. Now it's over 41. Rural communities have been grappling with youth outmigration for decades, and some small towns feel like memories waiting for a reason to reopen their arenas. On top of that, Indigenous rights movements grew into one of the most significant social transformations of the 21st century in Canada. The 1999 Supreme Court decision in Marshall affirmed treaty fishing rights in Atlantic Canada. Residential school history, still kept too quiet in the 90s, became a national conversation after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission launched in 2008 and delivered its report in 2015. Canadians my age remember when these topics were barely mentioned in school. Today, they are at the center of national dialogue. Comparatively, Americans around that same time were wrestling with different demographic pressures: higher population growth, earlier immigration waves, and a political system more polarized around those themes. In Canada, immigration generally had broader public support, in part because the country relied on it economically. That doesn't mean it was without tension, but the temperature was different. Looking at the Canada of 2024, you see a country transformed not by a single policy, but by millions of individual journeys reshaping the fabric of everyday life. Grocery store shelves, workplace lunchrooms, school playgrounds, all of them look profoundly different than they did 25 years ago. And yet, if you squint, you can still find something familiar: the instinct to apologize unnecessarily, the reverence for lineups, the comfort in diversity. Canada changed rapidly, but somehow it kept its tone. Some changes arrive like a storm, others like a slow leak. Canada's housing crisis was the slow leak, quiet, persistent, and devastating once you finally noticed the floorboards buckling. In 1999, the average home price in Canada hovered around $158,000. In Vancouver, it was closer to $300,000. In Toronto, just above $250,000. Those numbers look fictional now. By the 2020s, Canada had some of the least affordable housing in the world relative to income. Entire generations grew up realizing they might never own property in the cities they were raised in. Back then, renting was genuinely viable. You didn't need to win the job lottery to afford a studio apartment. International students weren't competing for basement rooms listed at prices that would have been comedy sketches in the 90s. Even university residences cost less. Most of us paid more for textbooks than utilities. Climate, too, reshaped Canada in ways we didn't fully foresee.
The late 90s already hinted at the future. The 1998 ice storm in Quebec and eastern Ontario was a warning shot, but the scale of wildfires, floods, and heat waves in the 2010s and 2020s rewrote the national relationship with nature. 25 years ago, air quality index was a concept you'd encounter only if you lived in Vancouver during an industrial incident. Now it's an app on every phone, checked routinely each summer. Winters changed. Prairie cold snaps still happen, but the consistency of deep winter has weakened. Skating rinks that once froze naturally now rely on refrigeration. In the Maritimes, storms seem more violent. In the north, thawing permafrost cracks roads and homes alike. Americans sometimes ask why Canadians talk about the weather so obsessively. What they don't realize is that for us, weather isn't just weather, it's history. When climate shifts, the stories we inherited shift with it. Economically, the labor market transformed too. In 1999, a job with benefits felt attainable. EI and social supports worked differently. Gig work wasn't yet a concept. Temp agencies were the closest equivalent. Young people graduating today face a landscape of contract positions, unpaid internships, illegal in many cases but still quietly common, and housing markets that make starting out feel like a logistical puzzle.
Through it all, Canadian optimism shifted from quiet confidence to a kind of resilient pragmatism. We became a country of people adjusting, adapting, recalculating. The middle-class Canada I grew up in didn't vanish overnight. It dissolved slowly, like a snowbank shrinking under spring rain. Every country changes, but Canada has always done it in a particular way, quietly, politely, with enough subtlety that you often notice it only in hindsight. And yet, for all the transformation of the past 25 years, some things remain unmistakably, stubbornly Canadian. Tim Hortons, for instance. Yes, it's corporate now, and yes, the donuts taste different, but step into one during a road trip and you'll still find the same cross-section of humanity: truckers, students, retirees, families sharing space without fuss. The accents shift, the languages shift, but the ritual is the same. Public health care, too, remains a point of national pride, even when we complain about wait times. Americans still ask with disbelief, "You don't get surprise medical bills?" And Canadians still respond with the same mix of pride and defensiveness, as if healthcare were a beloved but occasionally exasperating aunt. And then there's the feeling of the land. I don't mean patriotism exactly, I mean the way the country insists on being felt. Stand in a prairie field at dusk, walk through a Newfoundland harbor in the morning fog, smell cedar in coastal BC, or listen to the wind skim across northern lakes. You'll feel something ancient and immovable. No amount of technology or urbanization can erase that. Canada is louder now, more complex, more global, more digital. It's messier, more expensive, more politically assertive. Our conversations around identity, national, cultural, indigenous, and linguistic, are deeper and more urgent. Our cities feel like microcosms of the world. Our winters feel shorter, our summers smokier, our ambitions, strangely, feel bigger. But beneath the noise and novelty sits a familiar heartbeat, a country always negotiating its place between vastness and intimacy, between local memory and global influence, between who we were and who we are becoming. When I think of Canada 25 years ago, I don't feel sadness, I feel gratitude for having lived in a version of this country that was slower, gentler, and maybe a bit naive. And I feel curiosity for the Canada emerging around us now, bolder, more diverse, more connected, and still, somehow, carrying that same quiet kindness that has followed us for generations. Maybe that's the real constant. Not the buildings, not the prices, not the technologies, just the way Canadians keep finding each other in the middle of all this change. A neighborly instinct stretched across 10 million square kilometers. A country learning over and over how to grow without losing itself.